Tiens, on a découpé une femme en morceaux rue de la Bienséance à 2 pas du chat. Tiens, on a découpé une...
I am a feminist.
Quand une femme est violée, on commence par dire mais...
Vu le nombre de femmes qui sont concernées en France...
Elle n'avait qu'à pas exister.
Je trouve incroyable qu'on ne dise pas un peu ce qu'on vit dans ces moments-là.
Je vous vois, je vous crois.
We owe future generations a world free of sexual violence.
How powerful women can be when we do stand together.
Bienvenue dans la poudre.
C'était il y a 3 ans.
C'était il y a 14 ans.
J'ai été violée à 7 ans, harcelée sexuellement à 19 ans par un policier.
Un ami de mes parents.
Il y a quand même un problème à régler avec le désir de l'homme.
I don't know how you feel after this series of episodes focused on sexual violence, the Me Too movement, and the bullshit way society responded to that, but personally, I feel kind of bitter. I feel like taking a big break to process all this, or rather to think it through. Yes, I think the next step is to think, and think well. We need time to reflect on what we're going to do about all this, about these dominant abusers, about these suffering women, about this impossibility to answer properly, to repair properly. To get over shame and anger, we need a break and we need thought. That's why, before hanging up my gloves for this series anyway, I wanted you to listen to Sarah Schulman's voice. She's the author of an already mythical book, Conflict is Not Abuse, recently published in French by B42 Presses, because she helps thinking it all through. All of this and many other things. Because she suggests we separate conflict from abuse. Because she helps understand the social mechanisms ruling our cliques, our families, our communities. Because she offers tools to change the world and keep on moving. Just so you know, there is also a French dubbed version of this interview just above this episode in your Spotify feed. I am Lorraine Bastide, and you're listening to Me Too, and now, the epilogue, with Sarah Schulman. Sarah Schulman, you're a very prolific writer. Since the publishing of your first book in 1984, you have published countless novels, plays, screenplays, and essays, and received many distinctions and awards. You're also a tireless activist. You took part in feminist groups in the 70s. You were an active member of ACT UP. You co-founded the Lesbian Avengers in 1992, and always remained close to the LGBT rights movement. More recently, you committed to Jewish Voice for Peace, a solidarity with Palestinian people. It's such an honor to host such a prominent world changer in La Poudre today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Your latest publication in English, that Let the Record Show, is a huge archive work about ACT UP. You spent years collecting testimonies from active members of the organization in the 80s and 90s. We'll take a moment to talk about this important piece at the end of the interview. But we're here today to talk about Conflict is Not Abuse, which came out in 2016 and has just been translated to French. This book is a game changer for activism and for anyone who wants a world with more justice. It has had a very special trajectory. It took 10 years to find someone to publish it, and when it came out, it became viral. It even became a hashtag. Among all of your books, do you feel this one has a specific place in your career?
I think it was really the first book that was propelled by the readers themselves. You know, I absolutely could not get it published in the US. I tried so hard. I went to corporate publishers, university presses, leftist presses, even the feminist press wouldn't publish it. And I think the problem was that in America, subjects like Palestine or AIDS provoke so much anxiety that people see them as discrete. But in this book, I'm using them as examples of a larger phenomena, and I think that's what made it just so unacceptable. So I published it with a queer press in Vancouver, Canada, which is very far from New York. Arsenal Pulp. And I thought, no one is ever going to read this book. It's just going to go nowhere. In fact, Publishers Weekly didn't even review it. And then this thing started where people just started reading and writing about it online and debating it. And the audience started to grow. And I went on a book tour from East Coast to West Coast. And when I started, it was not small, but, normal. By the time I got to Seattle, there were 400 people in the room. And they were young people, people in their 20s. And what I realized was that they were associating what I was writing about to a phenomena in their own lives, which was cancel culture. But I wasn't writing about cancel culture. I barely knew what it was. I think I mentioned it once in the whole book, but it just worked for people. And, that was very exciting. And then actually Publishers Weekly finally did review it 5 months later. And they gave it a starred review, but they had to because so many people were talking about it. So I think it's the first time that readers have really beat the book business. So I have a lot of joy from that.
Yeah, thank you. It actually sounds like my own story with this book, which I wanted to share with you, because the person who advised me to read it is a famous French writer, Virginie Despentes. She told me, you should really read this book. It's going to change your life. And after I read it...
Oh, that's great. I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah. And after that...
wonderful.
After that, I couldn't help recommend it to every single activist around me. So, yeah, I was wondering if you knew why this book set off such an urge to be shared.
Maybe it's just that this was something that people were feeling and they didn't know how to express it. And the book just articulated something that they already knew to be true. And in a way, the whole Trump experience proved, I think, that the book is true, which is that perpetrators present themselves as victims. And we see this everywhere. And I use a lot of examples in the book. The police who murder Black civilians in the United States and claim that they were being threatened by a person walking down the street. Or the Israeli state constantly positioning themselves as victims of Palestinian people who are severely oppressed. But this also occurs in intimate relationships. And I start the book with showing the example of a famous football player who was videotaped beating his wife unconscious in an elevator and then dragging her out by her heels. And you're like, what could this woman have said to him that was so threatening that he felt he had to knock her unconscious? So we have so many examples. And then we get Trump, who's telling us that he's a victim, that he really won the election, and it has become so apparent in people's lives, from white supremacy, from Islamophobia, from the way that the borders of countries are places of violence, how many people are being excluded, that those of us who are the most protected and privileged have been repositioned as victims. And I think that it's clear. I think everyone can see that. What's harder for people to accept is that I take that and I think this is really the central insight of the book, that there's really two different kinds of places from which people depict themselves as being victimized when actually they're not. And one is, of course, from dominance. You're raised with an idea that you're better than other people and other people should not be able to question you. And if they make you feel uncomfortable, that's an attack and that's an abuse, and you should be comfortable all the time. Okay, that's one perspective. But then there's also that people who are traumatized, sometimes it's so hard to just keep it together that the idea that someone else thinks differently than you, or that someone else is different, or that they're asking you to question yourself becomes so unbearable because you can barely get through your life that their simple difference gets presented as attack or abuse. And this was very hard for people to take in, because I think some people felt that I was taking away their hard-earned recognition of their own abuse. And I'm certainly not. I'm doing the opposite. I'm drawing a very strong distinction between abuse and conflict. And I give a definition right at the beginning of the book, that abuse is power over. that no matter what you do, you cannot avoid it. Somebody else or some other entity has more power than you, and you are not in any way contributing to this dynamic. That's abuse, power over. But then there's conflict, and conflict is power struggle. And conflict can be more upsetting than abuse, but it's a different dynamic because all parties are participating on some level. It can be an uneven level, but both parties are contributing to the escalation. Now, you would think that in a healthy society, we would rather be in conflict than in abuse because then we have agency to change it. But in our society, people would rather be the complete victim than recognize that they are participating in creating an escalation, because the only way that you are considered eligible for compassion is if you are 100% pure victim. If you are in any way struggling with changing yourself or trying to have consciousness about your own behavior, you are not eligible for compassion. You're considered guilty. And this is the societal problem that I'm examining.
Yeah, and you make it absolutely clear. There is also this idea that is central to your book and that struck me as very accurate, is this idea of overstating harm. And it's fascinating how you prove it works, as you explain, in the domestic violence situation, inside a family, inside parents and children, between a heterosexual couple, but also at the level of police state violence. And I think what is most striking is the way you kind of explain the reaction we can be getting, for example, as a feminist activist, when we say, as a woman, there are some issues I have in this society I would like to be changed. And then men in front of us are going to say, oh, you're attacking men, you're being sexist against men. And it's very, I think this is the part that is most mind-blowing to people who read it. So this idea of overstating harm, could you please elaborate about it and maybe also explain how you came up with it?
Well, I was very influenced by Sara Ahmed, the Australian-British philosopher, who has this book called The Purpose of Happiness. And in it, she talks about how the demand to always be comfortable is a completely unreasonable demand, because the only way a person can always be comfortable is if other people are suppressed. And therefore, discomfort is a desirable and healthy state, right? So when we're made uncomfortable in some way because we're facing a truth about ourselves, we're facing a truth about other people that we don't want to recognize because we would have to adjust our behaviors, many people cast this as themselves being attacked or they're being abused. Yeah. Simple criticism or disagreement becomes cast as an attack. And this is the overstatement that escalates all the terms, because then you're the victim, and then your community, the people who identify with you, whether it's your clique or your family or your religious group or whatever, they're then required by this code of negative loyalty that we live with to hurt this other person simply because you don't want to face the truth about yourself. So these escalations have enormous consequences, and they have state consequences, because over and over we still see stories about someone has a power struggle with their child, and then they call the police, and the police come and they kill the kid. This happens regularly in the United States. Calling on the state escalates to the point of death, because the police in America have absolutely no ability to solve problems. I show that police officer is the profession with the highest rate of domestic violence of any profession in the US, including football player. So they are the last people that you should be calling. But because we want to prove that we're really, really right, and the other person making us question ourselves is terrible and an assault, we justify that by filing these police complaints or calling the police. And repeatedly, perpetrators are using the state and are using things like restraining orders or lawyer letters to justify their position so that they can maintain their dominance while asserting themselves as victims. And, this was the construction that I came up with to explain that phenomena.
Mm-hmm. You also explained very well what happens. Unfortunately, there are many examples of Black people killed by the police when they were absolutely no threat in the United States, but there are some examples also in France. And this could also be understood as a part of systemic racism, the fact of understanding someone who is absolutely innocent as a threat, right?
Right. I mean, in America, racism is all about false projections of criminalization onto Black people who were brought here as a crime and who, have been subjected to crimes by the state and collective crimes by white people, and yet are positioned as though they're dangerous and threatening when actually they are endangered. And the same paradigm can be applied to people with AIDS. When you look at, because one of the phenomena that I look at is global HIV criminalization, which is a global trend in which people with HIV are criminalized for not disclosing their status to their sexual partners, even if they're virally suppressed, which means that they would be biologically incapable of infecting anybody. And so here again, you see the same thing with Palestinians. People who are endangered and need our support get positioned falsely as dangerous. And this is the projection of the self, right? And we do this also intimately. We do something wrong to our friend, or we're unjust to them, or we're unfair to them. And then they in turn become upset by our originating action. And then we act like they are victimizing us. And we call on everyone around us to defend our ego by hurting that person. So in the most intimate realm and on the level of global geopolitics, you see the same construction.
I really love this sentence in the book, is the fact that something could go wrong does not mean we're in danger. And I think it also joins the idea of comfort not being the best thing we should wish for.
Right. And also that, we can feel terrible, but it doesn't mean someone else is hurting us right now.
Yeah.
We all have unresolved pain from the past, and that pain gets played out in the present. And we often ask the present to be accountable for pain that it did not cause. So that the fact that we could have associations that perhaps we're not aware of that make us feel threatened or in danger or angry or incapable of moving forward doesn't mean that the person in front of us is hurting us. We have to learn how to separate how we feel from the desire to punish. And right now they're linked, right? So a person only feels like they've been heard if the person they blame their pain on is punished. It's all linked. But if we could separate those two things so that people's pain could be addressed and recognized and legitimized without it having to be attributed to a source, then that link would not have to be in place. Because one thing that is quite clear to me personally is that punishment does not work. I don't think there's any examples of punishment working. And yet we are at a phase when we have higher and higher levels of punishment, both personally and state enforced.
Yeah, this part is really mind-blowing. And it also leads to, I think, one of the most important idea in your book is that idea of that the conducts of bullying, exclusion, and punishment can also be used by people who suffer from post-traumatic syndrome.
Right.
And that trauma and anxiety can lead to the same result as dominance.
Absolutely.
What consequences can this have?
Well, when you're on the receiving end of it, it can feel the same. Even if the projection comes from the powerful or the projection comes from the traumatized. And sometimes it's the same person, right? But the result is that we're being asked to be accountable for pain we have not caused. And there has to be a way that individuals can overcome this desire. So the answer that I propose in the book is to change our concept of what group loyalty really is. Like right now, we have this idea that loyalty means hurting the person that the person you are identified with is in conflict with. And this is applied, this is in cliques, this is in families, and also as a Jewish person born in 1958. I was raised with this idea that we're supposed to support the state of Israel because our relatives live there, right? That, it's your family, and so you're supposed to support them no matter what they do. And this concept of loyalty is not love, and it is not friendship. It's very destructive. And I'm proposing a different kind of idea about group loyalty, which is that our responsibility to the people we identify with is to help them negotiate, is to accept that when they recognize that they're participating in escalating a situation, when they recognize that they have responsibility, we reward them for that. We hug them. We kiss them for coming to a place of truth about their own behavior, instead of blaming them and then saying, well, then it's your fault, because they want our embrace. And that's why right now there's no encouragement to be self-critical. But if the third parties, the communities around us, if their job is to help us get through the discomfort of negotiating, then to me, that's real love, and that's real friendship, and that's the concept of loyalty that will move us forward.
Yeah, we need mediation. I've been saying this a lot in the feminist movements lately, but I think we're going to come back to this later. You just mentioned that you were raised in a Jewish family that was traumatized by Holocaust, and who wouldn't be, and transmitted you a certain perception of the Israel-Palestine war. I also know that as a lesbian, you have been very conscious about the consequences of homophobia in families because you suffered them, and you actually wrote a book about it too.
Right.
There is a phrase that we often say in feminism, that personal is political. And I think this phrase really works to this book, but also applies to your work in general. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I think that, my book on homophobia in the family, and bizarrely, it was really the first social analysis of familial homophobia, which was so strange because at that time, it was the one thing that every queer person in the world shared. But it had never been analyzed, and there wasn't even a term for it. I had to coin the phrase familial homophobia. But what I saw when I was writing that book was that you have this group, the family, and they decide that the queer family member is the problem, and that person should be removed. They should be shunned. And by doing that, they feel better about themselves. They feel superior, and they bond with each other about their superiority. But the truth is, the real problem is the homophobia of the family, not the queer family member. And so this was the first time that I observed this phenomena of the negative group bond. Then when I wrote Israel-Palestine and the Queer International a few years later, I already had this framework of the negative group. And I had that experience again. I was at a Palestinian village called Be'elin, and there was a demonstration every Friday because the Israelis were building the wall, and they were building it between the village and their olive trees. And so there was this demonstration, and people in the village were marching around, and then suddenly the Israeli soldiers came, and I'm looking at them, and of course they look exactly like me. And if my grandparents had not gotten a visa, I could have been one of them, and I'm looking at them, and then they shoot tear gas at this demonstration that's not doing anything. And the Palestinians take cut onions out of their pockets and hold them to their noses because this tear gas is a nerve gas that makes you think that you're suffocating. And I'm watching this insane display, and it was like my head spun around, like in the movie The Exorcist. And suddenly I realized that my concept of we, that who I was a we with, was no longer these Israelis who I was connected to by blood and by history, but these Palestinian people because they were the ones on the side of justice. And so that's when I realized that, I'd had a negative group bond with these Israelis, and that I had been justifying and defending them most of my life, and I was wrong. So that made the connection. And then when I started writing Conflict is Not Abuse, those formations were already in place for me.
This idea that the personal is political also resonates with the work of two feminist authors. I think the young generation is rediscovering right now, and that has been very important in your education. I'm talking about Adrienne Rich and Audre Lorde. I was wondering if you could tell me what they brought to you and how important they have been to your intellectual construction.
Oh, sure. Well, Audrey was my college professor. So, God, she was so great. And this was in the public university in New York where I teach now. So I learned most of my pedagogy from her because we had very, very large classes, and I have enormous classes. And she would put everyone in a circle so that nobody got lost. And she would stand in the middle of the room and teach each person individually by catching your eye and just saying, like, remember when last week you said this? Or then switch to somebody else. Remember in your paper when you said that? And it was like this 30-second individual tutorial so that we knew that she saw us as real people.
Wow.
But she, one day...
That's great.
Yeah. But one day she said, okay, class, take out your notebooks and write this down. Write this down. And she said that you can't fight City Hall, which is an American expression. You can't fight City Hall. That you can't fight City Hall is a rumor being spread by City Hall. In other words, that they will always tell you that you can't change something because it benefits them for it to stay the same. But that is absolutely false. All of these paradigms can be changed. Anything that people create, people can change. So that was very inspiring to me. And then Adrienne Rich had an article that came out, I think it was in the 70s. I was very young at the time. It was called Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. And in it, she argued that things that are presented to us as neutral and normal and objective and value-free, just the way things are completely constructed and enforced and filled with value. And so that, and this was like the mind opener of my lifetime. So from then on, all of my books, I try to look at structures that are invisible, but that are firmly in place and reveal them. That's kind of what I do, and very much always influenced by that concept.
Yeah, I thought it was also striking that you were influenced by both these women, because if I'm not wrong, I think they were friends, and they always had this very interesting conversation. They were always trying to find compromise and to see where their histories that were very different could manage to bring something that would not be a consensus, but a way to make feminism more coherent and more efficient.
Yes, they were friends, but they also had some complications in their friendships because of the racial difference in power. And there's quite interesting letters between them on this matter. But, Audrey did teach in the city university, and Adrienne taught there briefly. So at one point, they were colleagues in teaching the people of the city of New York. But I think that their relationship was very complicated. There's going to be a new biography of Audrey coming out soon, and I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, okay. I'm really looking forward to it.
The Rich estate has restricted their materials. They're not available. Yeah.
Okay, I can't wait to see it. So to go back to Conflict, I heard you say that this book has sometimes been mistaken for a self-help manual for leftists. And it really made me laugh because I had to confess you, I did read it like this.
Right.
So to come back to this thing you discovered when it came out, that many young people read it like this. Can you understand why?
Well, it's, I'm asking people to do something bigger than that. People are always attracted to their own lives primarily. But what I'm asking people to look at is the relationship between refusing to negotiate in your intimate realm and state power. And I'm trying to argue that there is a direct relationship from one to the other. So if they only look at the book and they only look at the first 2 chapters, and they don't want to read all that stuff about false loyalty and the Israeli state and Palestine and HIV criminalization and the police killing Black people, but they just want to look at how people on the left are mean to each other, they're going to miss the whole point of the book, which is that this constant escalation to avoid responsibility is what leads us to the abuse of state power. And so it's a big argument. I'm a novelist, right? So I'm used to these kind of book-length narrative drives that drive an idea and then produce a revelation. And a lot of nonfiction books are not like that. I think people are used to nonfiction books that are collections of different essays or different articles. But I try to build one big argument that goes all the way. So with my books, you kind of have to read the whole thing, really, to get the big idea.
Yeah, it's really important. But you also mentioned some situation you found yourself in, giving classes or giving conferences where people would misunderstand your point of view. And you explained how important it has been for the resolution of the conflict that you use these tools you offer us in this book, like communication and being accountable for yourself. And I think that's really relevant for anyone who is an activist right now, because there is so much trouble in feminism. And I wanted to talk about this idea of empathy that you already explained earlier in the interview, that it's impossible. No one is pure, no one is perfect, and we're all human. We make mistakes. We live in complex, contradictory situations. I just wonder if there is an actual limit to the people we should give our empathy to. I have a very specific situation in mind. Inside the feminist movement in France, and I know it's the same in the US or in the UK, some members carry a very harmful discourses about trans people. And right now there is this very strong movement of rejecting and punishing these women out of the feminist movement, because I guess their position is not a conflict, it's an abuse, it's an attack on trans people. Nevertheless, I think they might deserve empathy too, right? Their positions are not acceptable, but they don't deserve to be punished either. I cannot think properly on this one, and I was hoping maybe you could help.
Well, I mean, you have to defend people when they're being attacked. I mean, if trans women are being asked to defend themselves alone without any other support, they're not going to be able to resist, because we all need support when we're being unjustly attacked. So, it's like arguing with Zionists or arguing with anti-abortion people. There's a way that you want to show the person who's being victimized that you are on their side and that you're there for them, and to listen to them and find out what they need and how you can support them. But it's also worth it to engage the other parties in a way that is theatrical for the audience. So, for example, I am constantly doing public events with Zionists, arguing with Zionists. And I would do that with these anti-trans people as well, because you want to get your logic articulated in the public sphere in a way that the people who are watching can learn and take in your argument for equality. And if you refuse to talk to them, then that third party, the theater of it, they don't get to hear the argument. So the purpose of the discourse is not to change the minds of these very militant, prejudiced people, but to maintain a public discourse that can be helpful to others.
Yeah.
And that's why you have to be reasonable when you talk to people, and not just get crazy and get insulting, but to lay out what the real issues are.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Also, it's something you show in the book. If we react in a punishing and excluding way, we give these people arguments to say that they're not accepted and they're being victimized too. So I think it's probably clever to apply this duty of repairs, which is actually part of the title of the original book in English, and you talk about in the conclusion. Could you develop on that duty and what can we do to make up to it?
Well, because, I'm not like a Christian or a Buddhist or anything like that. I'm not a utopian. And I don't think that everyone can end up being friends necessarily. But to me, the goal of having this discourse with people that you're in conflict with is that the goal is that I can understand what their point of view is to such a degree that I can recite it and they will recognize it as authentic. And they can understand my point of view to the degree where they can recite it and I can recognize it as authentic. And then we can part knowing that we have been heard and that the other party knows what it is that we feel, even if they don't agree. And that's sort of my fine point goal. It's not like the happy hippie utopia where it's peace and love for everybody. I'm not going there. But I think that we can get to a point where we understand what the other person really thinks.
Yeah. I think I heard you say somewhere that everybody in France was obsessed with Me Too and wanted you to react on the Me Too movement because I guess people were struck by this.
Oh, that.
Yeah.
The book was written before Me Too. It's before Trump and before Me Too.
It's hard to believe,
so yes. It's before cancel culture and before all of that.
No, yeah, I say it's hard to believe because the book is so relevant for Trump, for Me Too, for cancel culture that it's really hard to believe that you wrote it way before all that. I think this book has the same kind of fate as Gender Trouble
because these dynamics were already there.
Yeah, totally, and you were already observing them.
Let's hope you're right about that.
Yeah, I had the chance to talk about this with Judith Butler, and they told me that they were absolutely fascinated by every time the book came out in another country at another moment, the society who were receiving the book would apply it to its own problematics, and problematics she had no idea would come up 30 years after. So I think this book is probably gonna have the same kind of destiny.
I hope so.
So yeah, I was thinking maybe French people would be interested to hear what you say about believe women, and I'm asking you that because I don't want this sentence to be misunderstood, and it has been misunderstood sometime. That you say believe women. Sentence believe women is not doing the job it is supposed to do. Could you elaborate on that?
Right. So the sentiment behind saying believe women or I believe all women is because women have not been believed when they've told the truth. Women have not been heard when they've told the truth. Women have not been listened to. This is a fact. And women must be listened to. However, white women have historically been used to justify crimes against Black people in the United States. We have famous cases from, the beginning of the 20th century, the Scottsboro case, where two homeless white women falsely accused some young Black men of rape. And these men ended up spending the rest of their lives fighting these charges. And it became an international case. So, we have the Emmett Till case, where a young Black boy was beaten to death because a white woman falsely accused him of whistling at her. And then we have very recent cases. We have a gay Black man was looking at birds in Central Park, and a white Canadian woman called the New York police and said that she was in danger. And, so the racial dynamics force us to say honestly that you cannot stand by the demand to believe women in every circumstance, because women are people too, and women lie for all kinds of reasons. And sometimes it's survival reasons, and sometimes it's trauma reasons, and sometimes it's dominance reasons, and because they have too much power in a situation. And we have to be sophisticated about this.
Yeah. We need nuance, right? It's basically what you say. For every situation.
Yes.
Nuance and complexity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why when someone tells you to hurt somebody, and we're always being told to hurt someone, whether someone's saying, my ex-boyfriend is terrible, you should never speak to him again, and so you spend the next 15 years of your life being mean to this poor guy, or whether they're saying, you know, refugees are going to destroy France or something like that, right? We're always being told that there's a group of people that we should be cruel to. And the most important thing is to ask these people, what is your life like? What do you think is happening? Why do you think this is happening? Asking someone, why do you think this is happening, is like the most important question you can ask anybody. You have to hear from the people who you're being asked to hurt about their own lives and their own realities before you draw any conclusions. Right now, we jump when somebody or a group of people are accused of something, we jump on the bandwagon, we retweet the accusation, but if those people have no voice and cannot speak, we can never come to a just conclusion.
Yeah, amen to that.
This is how you get the details and the precision of each situation.
Yeah. I also heard you in a conversation with a professor, and she was telling you sometimes it's hard. It's a big effort to make the phone call, to ask for details, to get implied in this situation. And sometimes you don't have the energy to do it. And I really loved the way you answered, because you say it's more energy to hate someone for 20 years. And I think it's important to remind this.
Right, because these animosities, these unjust animosities, they never go away. You know, whether it's intimate or social, you know, I'm sure we've all had experiences when we were 22 years old, we got in a fight with somebody about something and we don't even remember what happened. And when that person walks in the room and you're 50 years old, you still don't say hello to them. Mm-hmm. And you don't even know why. You know, these things last forever if they're not resolved. And certainly socially, these social prejudices against entire classes of people, whether it's drug users or immigrants, whether it's against people of a certain religion, whatever, you know, you inherit them from your family or you inherit them from your clique, and then you carry them on forever without any information and without any opportunity to renegotiate.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing this. Thank you so much. I would like now to take a minute to talk about Let the Record Show. Mm-hmm. I actually didn't read the book because I couldn't have it in French, but I listened to many interviews you gave about it. Mm-hmm. And it really made me understand that your real obsession as a writer is what works, what really makes social change happen. Mm-hmm. And you say ACT UP worked because it never looked for consensus. I think it's really interesting. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yes. So, you know, this was a movement of people who did not have much time to live, right? They were facing a terminal disease for which there were no treatments. And they were people who, as gay people in the early 1980s, had no rights whatsoever. Gay sex was illegal in the United States until the 2000s. There was no anti-discrimination laws. You could be fired from your jobs, and people had gone through profound familial homophobia. So these were people with no social status, and they were facing a terminal disease. And so they had to be effective. And the needs of sick people were what drove the agenda of the movement. So they had to reach their goals. It was a desperation. And as a result, they produced a methodology that was completely not bureaucratic. So there was only a one-line statement of unity. It was direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that was direct action as opposed to social service provision. So if you were doing direct action to end the AIDS crisis and you had an idea, basically you could do it. And if you had an idea and I didn't like your idea, I wouldn't try to stop you from doing it. I just wouldn't do it. I would find other people who wanted to do what I wanted to do, and I would do that, and you would do yours. So through that kind of radical democracy structure, there was a simultaneity of response that allowed for all of these different kinds of actions to take place at the same time. And these different strategies aimed at different social milieu, using different aesthetics. And this kind of very, very broad range of response is really what created the paradigm shift, because there were very few people in this movement. But because of the structure, this open structure, they were able to be effective on many different levels. Now, today there's a lot of push towards homogeneity, but I think that historically we can claim and be correct that there's no movement in history that forced people into one analysis and forced people into one strategy that actually succeeded. Because people are different and people cannot all have one analysis and they cannot all do one strategy. Good leadership is leadership that facilitates people being effective from wherever they are at, because people can only be where they're at. And of course, there has to be a bottom line of your values. And ACT UP's bottom line was direct action to end the AIDS crisis, and that was it. But it was a big tent politic, and that's really what we need now. Because so many different kinds of people are under attack and so many different communities are suffering. And very wide range of people want profound structural change. And these varied constituencies are never all going to agree on one strategy, or they're never all going to agree on one analysis. So we need to be flexible, and each of us act from where we are with the people that we happen to agree with on whatever subject we're involved in, as long as, and try to be effective. And instead of trying to change other people's minds to our entire analysis. And this means moving around. That each individual will have a range of communities that they're sympathetic with and a range of issues that they can make a stand on. And we have to move around and be in that way and be in the big tent. And I think that's a way of going forward that at least gives us a chance.
It's fascinating to hear you, because you have this ability to carry ideas that are actually very radical, that ask for a profound and systemic change, but also you are able to manipulate the idea of dialectical compromise, and I think that's why maybe you're sometimes misunderstood by people, and you prove that you can carry radical ideas without punishing anyone who doesn't share these ideas. I think it's mind-blowing, but it's probably maybe hard to apply inside the activist movement. For example, in France, I don't know if you heard about the state of the left in France, but it's a catastrophe. No one can agree on anything.
Well, then they don't need to agree, but on everything. But all you need that there are arenas in which there are some concrete demands that are reasonable, winnable, and doable. Utopian movements are also very important. And in American history, we've had periods where we had utopian movements. We had utopian socialists in the 1840s, and anarchists in the 20s, and communists in the 30s, and hippies in the 60s, and gay liberation, But we've also had these reform movements like ending slavery, women getting the right to vote, abortion rights, the AIDS activist movement. And our society moves forward when we have both. When we have a utopian dream, but we also have concrete demands. And without concrete demands, you cannot move forward. And these demands have to be winnable.
Yes, yeah.
So the more concrete the demand is, and the more winnable it is, the more likely you are to be able to coalesce a critical mass of people behind that to build a campaign. And you don't need a lot of people to be effective. A small group of people can do a lot if they are very focused.
Yeah, and also expert. I think what you show in Let the Record Show is that the activists of ACT UP also became expert in their own health, in their rights. They became lawyers or doctors, and the fact that technically about the subject also makes you a better activist, because you can offer these concrete propositions, right? Does this make sense?
Well, they learned. These people had no training. They were like performance artists who became an expert on a certain kind of medication. Because the larger goal is that we need to design our own solutions. If we're in an infantilized relationship to power and we're constantly asking the government or the teacher to fix the situation, they're never going to. They don't know how to fix it, and they don't want to fix it. We have to design the solutions and then present the solutions to the powers that be. And when they refuse, then we do nonviolent civil disobedience in a way that shows the public what our reasonable solution is. And in this way, we don't waste our energy. The worst thing is to have and I know this happens in France all the time, some huge demonstration, right? That people have to travel to Paris for this big manif, and it's a big effort, and then you march around, and then it's raining, and then someone is giving a speech, and then you go home. This is just like a total waste of energy. But you need campaigns. So you have a concrete demand, and every action that you do is towards that demand being heard and accepted. And so the crowd is empowered, and you have a function, which is to push this campaign forward, and each action leads to the next action. And that's when you have movements where everyone is involved. In ACT UP, no one was the official spokesperson. Every person could speak to the media. And we had a highly educated rank and file. So we were constantly doing teach-ins, and people were very sophisticated to the issues. And they were empowered. They did the actions. Nobody was standing there listening to speakers. And so that's why I wrote the book. And I'm not saying that it's a blueprint. This took place in the 1980s. This is a different period now. But it's just information about other ways to think, and also information about a movement that was not completely successful, but was very successful in that it transformed the entire future for people with AIDS all over the world, even though they didn't completely solve the problem. And so there's a lot to be learned there. It's very hard to get information about activist movements because the mainstream media misrepresents it constantly. So you have to do this deep dive where you really ask people, and you have to cohere and figure out what the strategies were. And so I hope that this will be helpful to people. I'm not telling people what to do. I just hope it will be inspiring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I really love the way that you worked on this book. I think it brings you back to your first job. You were a reporter, you were a journalist, and that's how you started working on AIDS activism and meeting ACT UP. And I mean, it's really familiar to me how the fact of recording voices and asking people for what they actually lived can be also a very political move and a world changer.
And also how they all contradict each other is a very important lesson as well, that all these people were in the same movement, and yet they do not agree on what happened, and that's important too.
That's fascinating. You've been a major activist in the second wave. Well, not everybody wants to call it this way, but the wave of feminism of the 70s. And if I'm not wrong, after this wave, a backlash happened. I would love the current wave, the younger feminist generation, to avoid this backlash. So, is there an advice you would give them in order to avoid it? Or to fight it?
There were a couple of things that happened. Ronald Reagan's election in the 1980s occurred because the capitalist right wing merged with the evangelical Christians, and they thought they could control them. It's very similar to when capitalists merged with the National Socialists in Germany. They thought they could control the fascists, but they couldn't. And they lost control of their party. And that's where we are now. So all the problems that we're having now are a consequence of that. On the side of the women's movement, and I'm thinking particularly about abortion rights, which was really the first issue that I was involved with in that way. I think one of the things that really defeated us was that heterosexual men were never involved in the fight for abortion rights. And so the movement, you can't have a political movement if it's not a place where the activists themselves can have love and sex, right? That, as Emma Goldman, the anarchist, said, if I can't dance, it's not my revolution.
Yes.
The movement has to make your life better. You can't go into a movement with the burden of responsibility. It has to be that it's going to expand your life. And you can't have a movement of only heterosexual women where there's no opportunities for sex and love. And that's, I think, one of the things that happened there. Now we're losing abortion rights in the United States. And I've never seen men really come through on that issue. And I think that was one of the great flaws.
Wow. it's really interesting that you say this. And I think actually the Me Too movement is very poor in men too. So maybe feminism is repeating the same mistake right now. I kind of tend to agree with you that there should be more feminist men for the feminist movement.
Right, or that these issues need to be in the forefront of the mixed movements. Like, why should abortion rights be the responsibility of women?
Yes, that's true. Yeah. And why should rape be the responsibility of women?
Right.
It sounds even more crazy. I wanted to ask you if you had heard this expression, lesbian genius. We have a feminist lesbian activist called Alice Coffin that wrote a book called Lesbian Genius. And I think it really applies to your work too. You. What do you think of this expression?
Yeah, I enjoyed her book. I read it, and I haven't met her, but no, I mean, it's okay. You know, there's always this tension about, you know, I think because I'm a novelist, right, and I'm a playwright, and I want my work to be in the big world without having to suppress the lesbian content. So it functions on two levels. Yes, I want to be seen as a lesbian, and then I also want that work to be understood and appreciated by other people.
Yeah, of course.
It's the second part that's the hardest.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, totally. But I think that what she says about lesbian having this point of view on life and on society that is so specific that they're more able to redo the decoration of a room or the way the chairs are put in a meeting room in a different way from anyone and really change things. I mean, I think it's really, really relevant.
Well, you know, when people are marginalized and in opposition, they tend to be very inventive and resilient, and they have information about how they live, and they have information about how the dominant group lives, and the dominant group only knows about themselves. However, once that group starts to get some power or become bourgeois in some way, they lose that. And we see that now. You know, I think one of the reasons that there's so much interest in the queer 80s is because gay culture right now is so boring and banal. What is gay culture right now? You know, it's about assimilation and privatization, and there's nothing inherently there's no such thing as inherently radical, right? It's always about where you're positioned and what choices you make. And those things are constantly changing. I mean, this was the lesson of the Jews, and this is the lesson of the white gay men. And, you know, I just read a trans novel by Tori Peters, and it's called Detransition Baby, and it has a scene of all these trans people at a party in Brooklyn, and they all went to the most elite private universities and work in tech. And you're like, okay, is that inherently a radical group of people? Probably not. So these things can change very quickly. And, you know, in the end, I think radicality is about an intention and an action.
Wow, thank you so much for that. Sarah Schulman, if I tell you La Poudre, the powder, the name of the podcast, what do you think about?
Skiing.
Oh, nice. I love it.
Oh, so what are the double meanings of the name of the podcast besides powder? What else does it mean?
Well,
power.
For me, it was a way to talk about, I guess, makeup and war at the same time, and you know, it's really interesting because I asked the question to all of my guests, and every single guest has a different answer. So, and I knew this would happen with this name. So it's also my way of breaking the idea that there would be such thing as women or femininity or a single way of seeing what la poudre means or what la femme means. So there is no good answer.
Well, thank you so much for all the time you put into this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you to Sarah Schulman for speaking up in La Poudre. Lorraine Bastide is the executive producer of La Poudre, a podcast prepared by Gaia Marty and Marie-Laurence Chéry, assisted by Marie Vincent, who also wrote the transcription of this episode. The song of the opening credits is by Bonnie Banane, and the piano of the intro is by Jeanne Chéral. Merci Jeanne. Recorded, produced and mixed by Marion Emery, and broadcasted exclusively on Spotify.